Today I'm here to talk about the new releases I've been reading recently, as well as a couple backlist books. This is going to cover science fiction and fantasy, and I'm trying really hard to find more science fiction books to balance out these videos, because as I say, there is a plethora of fantasy books out there for new releases, and it's a little bit harder to find the science fiction, a little bit harder to find the good science fiction, but I have some fun ones to talk about today. Let's get started. First, let's start with science fiction, as I like to do, beginning with Space Brooms by A.G. Rodriguez, and this is one of my most anticipated releases. So from the premise, I definitely thought the story sounded fun, and I'm happy to report back after reading it that it really was the good, enjoyable, light, funny story I was looking for. Certainly in terms of tone, it is on that lighter side, but I knew that going into it and just went along for a good ride. At the same time, I felt like the story had enough stakes. There is enough that happens in there. There are things that progress, and that's often my complaint with these really surface level science fiction books, is that they can be so paper thin that they fail to hold my attention, and I just kind of check out for more of the goofiness of them. Instead, this one has a silly sounding plot, but at the same time is actually quite engaging, quite fun. It feels like the kind of thing that would translate well into a really fun episode of a TV show or something to that effect, and I really enjoyed it. It probably won't end up on my favorites of the year, just depending on how the year goes, only because if you look at my list, if you look at my favorites, I tend to be more drawn to the darker stories, which this one is not. And so in terms of it being a memorable read, it may not really stick in my brain as I go to collect my list at the end of the year, but depending on your taste, it might be more of a favorite. And again, just because it's not a personal favorite doesn't mean that I didn't have a really good time reading it. Sometimes books are just meant to be enjoyable and fun, and that is exactly the experience I had here, which in some ways is just so refreshing to say. Again, after 2024, which was a rough year for science fiction, I'm glad to see this one coming through as a light, fun sci-fi read that actually delivered. Next up is When the Moon Hits Your Eye by John Scalzi, and this is a story that's set in a near future where the moon has been turned into cheese, and then we follow the story through a number of different perspectives in each chapter where we see different individuals reacting to this new situation. Now, this is one that has an absolutely ridiculous premise, and I've been somewhat hit or miss with John Scalzi lately. I've had much better luck with his older books. His newer ones have just been right out the window goofy in a way that I couldn't take seriously or just deal with how silly they were in general. So I went to this one with tepid expectations, and it kind of surprised me, but not in the way I expected. So what I will say is that this author is taking a really strange, silly premise and almost trying to play it straight. And so this book felt more serious than I expected it to, and instead I felt like you have this really bizarre setup, and then he is really showing you how people's lives are changed by this, and having again all these vignettes, these little individual stories throughout the narrative. And I think in another author's hands with a slightly different premise that didn't immediately drop my suspension off of the cliff, I think that this one could have been really successful. I've come to really appreciate these novels that are told almost in vignettes like this, but it just was difficult because I think that John Scalzi shines in his humor, and I think it's always, again, a tricky balance for me, but I don't think he really has the chops, or at least it's not his focus typically in writing, of having these really complex characters or this really nuanced, quiet story of a near future. And I appreciate him trying it. It just didn't work for me, but at the same time, I enjoyed it more than his last few books where they were just too silly. The one with the cat villain, I just could not get into at all. And so I'm pleasantly surprised that this one was more serious. I would love to see the author go more in this direction. And while it wasn't a complete success for me, I still appreciate a lot about it. I gave it a fair average rating. And again, depending on what you're looking for, depending on what you like in Scalzi's work, your mileage may vary. It's a little bit of a wild card book. I like what he's doing. I'm just more excited for what he does next. Next, we have The Sea Eternal by Emery Robin, and this is a sequel to a book that came out last year, The Star Undying, and that was a space opera that was very loosely inspired by historical Rome and Egypt, and particularly the relationship and back and forth between its leaders at a particular point in time. And so the first book was one that was very unexpected. It's quite different than almost what you would expect from that premise unless you are a big history buff. There was a lot explored in that book that was outside of my knowledge of history, and I couldn't necessarily always see where the author was pulling from with that influence. But the story was well written, it had intriguing characters, and it was just very different. While it is technically classified as science fiction, it definitely has more of a fantasy feel in terms of the narrative being very character focused, very politically focused. It just feels like one of those fancy stories that just happens to be set in space, as opposed to leaning into the more technical aspects of that future. So after enjoying the first book, but it wasn't necessarily a favorite at the time I read it, I went into this one, having trouble getting into the story. Some time has passed since the last publication, but I am used to reading Orbit's new release when they come out, which is usually about a year between books, and this one just really was difficult to get into. I wasn't as pulled into it, and I think especially with a book that is very politically heavy, there's just a lot to digest, and I just found this one less compelling. Again, I don't know if I read them back to back if I'd have a stronger experience. I can't really say to that, but I was a little bit let down by this one. Again, I think it's still interesting, but the biggest thing for me, and I do want to preface this, is that it doesn't really scratch my science fiction itch. I would much more recommend it to those of you like myself that do also enjoy politically based fantasy, and it reminded me much more of my love of those kind of books. And I recognize I always get kicked back whenever I call a science fiction book more like fantasy, because of course science fiction is a large genre of itself, and not every single science fiction book has to involve hard science or technological details in it in order to count towards the genre. But there's something in the way the narrative is written that just doesn't fit the traditional box of what we think of science fiction. So I just like people to go in with those expectations, because if I'm in the mood for something really complex and I just want to have big info dumps about an imagined future, this one doesn't satisfy that itch. Instead, it much more feels like you're swept away to a faraway place long ago, and feels much more reminiscent again of those historical fiction roots rather than the science fiction ones, if that makes sense. So like this one to a degree, but a little bit of a letdown. I wasn't over the moon about the first book, so I definitely think your mileage may vary. If you adore the first book, you'll probably like this one a touch more than I did. Still want to see it through, still want to see more by this author, so I definitely recommend checking it out. If you're at least interested, give it a try for yourself, because really it always comes down to what you like. Next we have The Gate of the Feral Gods by Matthew Dinniman, and this is the fourth book in the series Dungeon Crawler Carl, which is so hard to say that series name on camera, but this is a series that I have been reading since last year. I am reading the physical books. I got the opportunity from a friend who gifted me a copy of the first audiobook, but since then I've been reading them solely from the physical editions that I've received for review, and I can definitely see, having tried both editions, that I do see why so many people find the audiobooks to be the entry point, and it's largely due to the fact that I think it lends itself well to that. So to back it up, this follows a man who ends up entering this dungeon that is very much meant to be a nod to our video game culture, and clearly just if you love things that are multiplayers, you're gonna have a good time with this one. You're gonna see those references along the way. This book is technically often classified as science fiction because it does have an alien aspect to it, which is all in the premise, so I'm not spoiling anything. But in terms of the narrative, I'm gonna say this again, it really reads much more like fantasy. So in my mind, when you're playing around with video games, often they kind of get smushed into the science fiction genre just because video games are on consoles, which are involving technology, so naturally it must be science fiction. But in terms of everything that's happening, again, you have fantastical creatures and a fantastical world, and none of it is really grounded in our science today. And while it has, again, the backdrop of that alien aspect to it, for me, this scratches that fantasy itch, that geeky progression fantasy that a lot of us enjoy, rather than something for science fiction. That being said, if you already enjoyed this series, I definitely recommend continuing on. This one feels very consistent with the last ones. I'm a fan of the series, but not a die-hard fan like so many others. I find it to be very fun. It's very dialogue heavy and humorous, which again, I can be a little bit hit or miss on. And so I think, again, people who really love it really find these books funny. I'm more of the kind to kind of smirk at the book and think, oh, that's fun and funny, without actually laughing out loud. But it's just easy to fly through. They're long books, but very engaging, page turners, all of that. So I think there is a lot to love here. So again, I think if you've already started the series, you know you're going to continue on with the book. book. I have so many friends that adore this one. And so if you're new to the series, definitely go back to the beginning. You do want to read in order. But this is, again, perfect for those of you that love these really bingeable series, things like the I Am Bob universe, and again, a lot of John Scalzi's type work. All of those will kind of feed into the type of book that you'll get with this one. And I think it's a lot of fun. It's got a goofy companion to it. And overall, it's just a good adventure. Really looking forward to continue on with this one. Next up is The Ashfire King by Chelsea Abdullah. This is the second book in the series that starts with The Stardust Thief. This is a fantasy series inspired by Middle Eastern culture, where it's pulling in myth and magic. Particularly, it is set in a world where the jinn exist, and all of that is tied together. We follow multiple perspectives of those that are in one point at the beginning of the story. One is a thief, there is another that is a prince and of royalty descent, and of course the different perspectives eventually come together. There is some simmering romance in the first book, which normally would be a negative for me, but I fully admit that I got pulled into it, which largely affected my enjoyment of the story. I really ended up wanting to see where it was going to go and had a lot of fun with that. There also is some fantastic world building. I thought the writing itself was lush and very much supported that world, where I just wanted to find out more about it, which slowly was trickled down to the reader, where they're describing the clothes and the spaces and the traditions, and I found it all to be just very intriguing. I'm someone who grew up watching the Disney shows like Aladdin, and so very much coming from perhaps that North American perspective on some of these Middle Eastern cultures and magic and myth and all of that. But really, it was something that drew me in. I thought it was a very engrossing story, and I was eager to continue on with the second book. I like this one. I want to say I like the first book a bit more, and sometimes that happens with me, where there's something about the introduction to a new world and setting that is just so awe-inspiring for me, where if you go into the next book, the world no longer feels as fresh because I've already spent time in there. I would say that while I prefer the first book, this is a strong sequel. Definitely a contender for my favorite fantasy of 2025. We have a long way to go, but this one is very close to the top right now, and I can't wait to see where it falls in the final ranking. So again, if you are like me and love fantasy that's told from different cultural perspectives and drawing from different pieces of the world and turning them and twisting them around into something magical and fantastical in and of themselves, I had a really good time with this one. The characters are enchanting and engrossing and flawed in the best ways possible. And I gotta admit, I enjoy a little bit of romance in the right setting. I never thought I would say that, but I gotta start admitting it. Sometimes I want to cheer for these couples. Overall, a really good package, solid story, and I highly recommend. But again, go back to the first book with The Stardust Thief. And finally, we have Acacia by David Anthony Durham. And this is a book that I feel like is really recommended in certain circles of the internet, and I don't hear about in other places, so this might be new to you or not. But this is an epic fantasy story that follows at first this ruler who is on the throne. There has been generations of peace. However, at the beginning of the story, and this is on the setup, the back of the book, there is an assassin that comes for them. And then because of that attack, they end up having to pass along their kingdom to their offspring, and everything goes from there as there is vying for the kingdom. Now, this is one I often see recommended to those of us that are impatiently waiting, or let's be honest, have given up on waiting for the end of A Song of Ice and Fire. And so I can definitely see those comparisons, while this one is at the same time very much its own. So it's set in this world where you have a kingdom that was at somewhat of peace, and then there is an incident that shakes that up, and then again you have different people maneuvering around, different political groups, and you have really rich world building, really intricate characters, morally gray characters. It doesn't lean into the grimdark to the degree by any means of George R. R. Martin's books, but I do see similar threads, similar complexity. It's another really large book. I really enjoyed it. I should continue on with the series because I know there's more. I actually don't know why I haven't continued now that I say that. I read it, really enjoyed it, and put it down and said, that's a great book. And so I really should look up about book 2, see if I can get it from my library. But I do recommend it. Again, maybe you've heard about it, maybe you've read it, but I don't see it talked about on the channels I watch as much on BookTube, and I don't know why, because I feel like it's a kind of book that everyone else on Fantasy BookTube is really going to enjoy, and I feel like it's kind of a sleeper hit in this community. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm watching the wrong channels, but again, highly recommend. This was such an engrossing one, and I had a great time with it. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know the books I talked about. Which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? And again, I would love to hear what new releases are you reading. There are so many books coming out. I can't keep up with it. I'm really trying to focus on ones that I think could be favorites, and and just getting my hands on as much science fiction as possible, which is, again, a task in itself, but I'm up for the job. If you're new to my channel and do want to stick around, I do read a lot of science fiction, fantasy, and other dark things, so hit that subscribe button if you want to, hit that thumbs up button if I deserve it, and hit the little notification bell if you want to hear more videos from me. Thanks so much for watching. Talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.